start with the spiritual personalities conversation. You touched on obviously the 4 different aspects of knowledge and action. If you can go a little bit more into the personality types themselves and explain them a little bit further.
Okay. So yeah, we weren't able to get into that in the lectures, or we can kind of get a bit into it now. So if you remember, this will be a good quiz. What were the 2 types of knowledge? What was the first type of knowledge? Experience focus. And the second was? Judgment. Very good. And then what were the 2 types of behavior? This is easy. Action and? Very good. So the idea is that on both of these different domains, knowledge and behavior, a person will tend towards one. And we like to make the analogy like of the right and left hand. You will possess the capacity for both, but you will prefer one. What will be a dominant feature? It will be the thing that you actually pursue. So for knowledge, you can either focus on the experience focused or judgment focused. And for action, you can either be behavior, you can either be action or restraint. So the idea of those 4, hand of power, voice of justice, eye of vigilance, and heart of inspiration, is that they possess all the four different permutations that you can get from those different variables. So for hand of power, it's combining judgment-focused knowledge, so understanding your rights and responsibilities, knowing the objective values of things, and knowing what you need to pursue, and having those kind of boundaries set with action. And so this is the hand of power. It's the person who has kind of a mission. They are goal-oriented. They're purposeful. They know exactly what they need to achieve. And they're the people in the community that you see are like a force of nature. They're involved in so many different things, and they're very focused on achieving the greatest good that they can in the world. And then the second one is voice of justice. This combines judgment-focused knowledge with restraint. And these are people who are focused, they have judgment-focused knowledge, meaning that they have very strong moral senses of what's objectively right and wrong, and they're more focused on restraint, staying away from evil, things like that. So, Amar bil Ma'ruf wa Nahy anil Munkar, that there's this concept of encouraging the good and forbidding the evil. Some people are focused more on forbidding the evil, some people are focused more on encouraging the good. And so on for the rest as well. Heart of inspiration is experience-focused knowledge with action, and eye of vigilance is experience-focused knowledge with restraint. So based on what you've got, and we'll do a show of hands. Who here got hand of power? Okay, 3 people. Wow, rare personality here, mashallah. Who got eye of vigilance? Mashallah, a lot of cautionary people. That's very good. Who here got heart of inspiration? Okay, and who got voice of justice? MashaAllah. So pretty much even spread. Hand of power is a bit less, but alhamdulillah, interesting. So what I would encourage all of you to do with that is to go online, check out the article, and you can see, based on the 2 different attributes that you have, it goes a bit more in depth about the strengths and the weaknesses associated with each of those different traits.
Add this to this. So Jazakallah khair for explaining. And one of the wonderful aspects of this research is the practical nature of it. So maybe if you can go into a little bit of the Sahaba profiles, how people can apply this to their lives. And I know we received a couple of questions just for everyone to know. So this quiz is available on yaqeeninstitute.org. You can go ahead and take it. And for those who want to learn more, there's an article actually that Brother Zuhair has published on there that details the research.
Nazir is actually co-authored, so alhamdulillah, it's very good that he's here as well. You want to chime in on that at all? Or?
No, that's fine.
Okay, so based on the based on the spiritual personality profile that you get, number one is if you go online, you can see we kind of have different sahabis who kind of fit with those different aspects, and we actually correlated them with the 4 first khulafa of this ummah: Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, Ali. And I'd be curious to think to see what you guys would think. Who do you think the personality of Abu Bakr radiallahu anh was? It's maybe hard to do actually.
If you haven't seen the answer.
In any case, we'll leave it at that. I think that would be a bit more difficult. But the idea is that we have a different sahabi associated with each. And the idea of where you go from there really is the idea of focusing on understanding your strengths and starting with that. But this is an important point of the profiles, that it's an important misconception a lot of people have. We're not saying, oh, if something's your weakness, then you don't need to do it. Like Allah doesn't expect you to do any of that in your, of course for obligations we all know that this is something everyone does. And the beautiful thing about Islamic practice that I really discovered when looking at these ideas is that it's so amazing how diverse the actions that we're meant to do and we're obligated to do. Because there's this concept of personality growth where a person steps outside their comfort zone and does things that kind of are not naturally kind of appealing to them, but they do it with the understanding that it's a growth choice and it will lead to some sort of growth. And so this particular concept applies very much to spiritual personality, where a person might be focused, on more of the activism front, and they kind of have to step outside their comfort zone to be a bit more perhaps, by themselves. They have to kind of contemplate, be a bit more inward thinking. And then the other contrary is also true. Someone who's very focused on kind of contemplation, dhikrullah, being by themselves, being able to pray, etc., perhaps stepping outside their comfort zone and actually being involved in the community and being engaged in different things. Actually, Sister Bar was mentioning to me even just after one of the sessions, you should get involved in do some political engagement. And I was like, what political engagement? No, it's not for me. And then I realized, I said, that's something that could possibly be kind of, it's not naturally appealing to me, but it's something that could be a growth choice that will grow my personality and enable me to explore different aspects of myself. Because at the end of the day, all these capacities are within us. It's that we prefer to do one over the other. And so there are dormant forces within that take more time and effort to bring them out. And the principle in Islam is, the more effort, the greater the reward. So perhaps, because some person might say, it's not fair. Some people, it's so easy for them to read so much Quran. And for me, it's harder. Well, for what they get in quantity, you can make up in quality. Because they don't have the same level of striving as you do when you are focused on reading the Quran and trying to go forward and contemplate its meaning. And so the quantity and the quality, they balance each other out.
Jazakallah khair. And unfortunately for time's sake, inshallah we'll ask Dr. Nazir 2 questions and then we will have to close. So in trying to compile everything here, of course in the question on methodology, and you referred to scholarly customization, that can allow room for subjectivity. So
Right.
if you can address that and maybe talk a little bit about the confines that we can have, and further address the role of ijma' in curbing some
Sure.
of that subjectivity.
Absolutely. Okay, Jazakallah khair. So these are great questions. So first of all, we talked about the importance of following the logic of tradition. One of the questions was, couldn't somebody have new logic today that was not accessible to people previously? It's not like we've evolved to become more intelligent, right? We don't have some new intellectual capacity or some new lobe of our brain that they didn't have. The thing that could be different, however, and some of the exceptions of when a new opinion is not problematic, you'll see on the slide, when new empirical evidence is available to us that wasn't available to them, for example. So one simple case is the example of reconciling the different ahadith about the stages of the human embryo, right? The nutfa, the mudgha, the alaqa. At what time period does each stage happen? So the conventional opinion was that each was happening in a 40-day consecutive set of periods. So it's a total of 120 days before the angel is breathed into the embryo. But with the advancement of medical technology, now this is readily discernible to us, right? We do ultrasound examinations on pregnant patients every day. We can actually say, no, the other opinion, which was classically the minority opinion, actually makes more sense to say that these are all happening within that initial 40-day period. So that's a case where we're not changing based on us coming up with some new logic, but it's based on different empirical evidence that we have that they didn't have. Sometimes different circumstances can raise new questions that weren't raised before. So something may have been taken for granted, and it's not because everybody had researched it and come to a good answer on it, but it's just because nobody had reason to really challenge that assumption. So it wasn't really a conclusion, it was just kind of an assumption. So for example, the flood of Nuh alayhi salam, right, being a global flood. Now that's generally an assumption that most classical commentators had. And now if we have modern archaeological evidence that says, no, the entire world was never completely submerged underwater, it's not problematic for us to say, hey, you know what, the Quran doesn't say this, and it was probably just an assumption that people had, so we can revisit that issue in light of that new information. Similarly, fiqh rulings. So, for example, smoking. Cigarette smoking was something that initially some scholars said, well, what's the difference between this and caffeine? What's the harm, right? What's the reason why we're going to consider this prohibited? And now, in light of the accumulation of empirical evidence, we can say no. Clearly, this is something that has many harms linked to it. One is the darar, the physical harm of causing lung cancer. Another, you can say, is the addiction, which relates to contradicting the Sharia principle of preservation of mind. So there's many different things that are elucidated by that ongoing investigation. So a ruling can change if it was not well grounded to begin with because of the absence of information, or if it was connected to an illah. An illah is a legal basis for that ruling that's no longer present today as well. That's another reason why a ruling can shift. So I hope that answers the question.
Barakallahu feek. And we do have some time to get audience questions after this last question, which is the practical aspect of this. So there's obviously an abundance of content online, scholars, conferences. How do people parse through and identify what those sources that use proper methodology are so that they can learn and practice the deen properly?
Yeah, so that's a really great question. And one of the things that a lot of scholars have pointed out is there's a need today for scholars to come together and form collective groups and committees and councils so that people understand where that peer recognition falls, right? So just like we have in every other profession, right, we have an understanding of, okay, this person's going against the consensus of their college of professionals. In the same way, you have scholars coming together, bringing the different expertises, and then saying, this is something that we all agree upon. So we have that, for example, in different world fiqh councils. Right? When a new issue is presented and it's debated by multiple scholars, and then they come out with a ruling, that carries more authority for the average layperson than one individual person saying, hey, I thought this was a really good idea, but nobody's ever debated or cross-examined this idea, but I'm just going to put it out there on a Facebook Live or whatever, right? So recognizing where that authority lies in groups and communities of scholars coming together is an important part of sorting through that.
Jazakallah khair. Audience question, please go ahead. And sorry, we'll keep it to 30 seconds each, please.
Okay, so just stop me when I reach at 30 seconds. Based on my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, but there are some opinions that predate the madhab. So you might have an opinion from Awza'i or Thawri or something, and that opinion does not find its way into one of the madhab and it becomes abandoned. Yeah. And then you might have a fiqh council today that says that wants to make things easy and says, hey, look, we have this fatwa from pre-madhab era. We're just going to blindly take it without rationalizing it or somehow finding scripture justification for it. So my assumption is, correct me if I'm wrong, my assumption is this blind adoption of an old fatwa is not allowed, and it has to be rationalized somehow such that it becomes at least equally as strong and equally substantiated in comparison to the current ongoing opinions. So if you can just clarify that. Sure.
Yeah, so that's an excellent question. So if you look at early difference of opinion, there were certain opinions, there were different madhahib that became extinct basically. So you mentioned Al-Awza'i is one of them, Al-Layth ibn Sa'ad, Ibn Jarir al-Tabari. Now sometimes contemporary scholars of fiqh have actually gone back and supported one of those opinions. So for example, when you're using rubbing alcohol on your hands, is that alcohol physically najis? Right? You have the opinion of the four madhahib that says yes, but there's many early scholars of Islam, such as Imam Layth ibn Sa'ad and others, they actually said, no, it's not physically najis, and when you examine that scripturally, it has to go back to that being scripturally stronger, right? It can't just be on the basis of personal desires, and that's something all of the scholars mentioned. So what we shouldn't be doing is saying, well, we like this opinion because it's more convenient, and let's do a survey of all the opinions that people have said in the past, and then just try to find an opinion that agrees with what we've already predetermined to be correct. That would be, what the scholars of Islam, actually Imam Al-Awza'i himself said, whoever searches out for the rukhas, right, for the dispensations, for people who are, or for opinions that give leniency in every single matter, then basically they've left the very concept of Islam, because the concept of Islam is submission to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, not following desires. So that's an important clarification point.
Go ahead, sister.
So I took the quiz and I read your papers. That's where this question comes from.
Sounds good.
You presented Islamic personalities, but I felt like it was better interpreted as a few prominent scholars' thoughts on different personality-related behaviors. Personality and dealing with your personality are two different things. Personality is mostly stable over time. Your behavior and reaction can be adjusted. For example, one of the traits you have is judgment, which isn't a personality, it's a behavior. You've also created mutually exclusive dichotomizations that don't make sense to me and don't feel like they're opposite ends of the spectrum. So in an effort to avoid pseudoscience tendencies, how do you plan to develop and validate your scale on a statistical level moving forward?
Jazakallah for the question and feedback and criticism. So firstly, I'm just trying to remember kind of the points mentioned. I think the first point that you mentioned,
Judgment being not a personality, but a behavior.
Okay, so I'll mention that point. So the idea of judgment being a behavior rather than a personality type. The idea is that the name and the label is not what's important, it's the concept. The reason why we use the term judgment is because we wanted to give it from the tradition what the terms that were used. So ilm al-ahkam, knowledge that is focused on judgments, on ahkam, on kind of right and wrong, that's what's being discussed. In terms of what the actual personality characteristic is, if you've noticed, we actually didn't really talk, and that's where your criticism is, we actually didn't give personality characteristics. We gave manifestations of possibly personality tendencies. So for instance, the idea of judgment-focused knowledge, there could be some construct underlying it. And in the paper we talked about how perhaps it's correlated to conscientiousness, perhaps it's correlated to XYZ, we don't know. That's something that we don't know. But what we do kind of find, and this is something that Ibn Qayyim talks about as well, is that some people focus and tend to focus more on this. What exactly makes that person do that? We didn't identify it yet. So that's the kind of reason why we don't really have the personality variables, but we have the kind of end manifestation. That's why it's spiritual personality, because it's talking about, as I mentioned in my talk, it's talking about we have our personalities, how does it manifest spiritually? So technically it's not a personality trait because it's not as fundamental as a person's stable personality, it's a manifestation in the spiritual domain. So that's why experiential, judgment, action, restraint, these are just descriptions of behavior as you mentioned. Because that's the idea. Some people will behave more in those different ways. Now in terms of kind of the dichotomies, why did we choose this or this? It seems like just one particular scholar. Yeah, this is the idea. So the reason why we call it an Islamic spiritual personality theory is because a lot of it is from contemplating Quranic verses. So the idea of knowledge and action being the first two instincts. If you actually look at, for instance, Carl Jung, and are you familiar with the Myers-Briggs personality? So that was actually coming from Carl Jung's personality theory, his book Psychological Types. Then after that, Myers and Briggs, they kind of developed the inventory and whatnot. And he actually starts conceptually like we did. He starts thinking, okay, what are the two basic kind of attitudes or the two basic functions of the person? And he says it's perception and judgment. Those are the two different things that the human mind is designed to do. And then he pontificated further and said, okay, there are two types of judging, feeling versus thinking. Okay, there's two ways of perceiving. There is intuitive and sensory. And then from there he says, okay, these are the different kind of functions that occur to the human mind. And so kind of similarly, conceptually, we kind of said, okay, these are the two different instincts that's clearly within our tradition, clearly within any reading of the Quran. These are the two different ways that people manifest their spirituality. Through learning and their knowledge and through behavior. It's very fundamental. And then talking about, okay, what are the different ways of learning? Now in terms of, these are not meant to be kind of opposites on a spectrum. In fact, the whole point is that, like we said, it's right and left-handed. It's not that if you have experience focused, it means that you cannot have judgment focused. Like you're here, it's like binary, so that you're here and you're definitely not over there. That's not the case at all. It's that you can actually build both, but generally speaking, people focus on one aspect more than the other. That's the idea. And then the same thing with behavior as well. And behavior is actually a direct reading from Ibn Qayyim himself. And so yes, it's taking from the Quran and Sunnah, it's Islamic in the sense that Ibn Qayyim took these ideas from that. We took those ideas from Ibn Qayyim and kind of put it together into something that would possibly be kind of a first iteration of what an Islamic spiritual personality theory might look like. There's a lot of room for, as you mentioned, validation, statistical analyses, and that's one of the reasons why we had the quiz put out. In fact, we've kind of Sorry, I think in fact we've kind of actually kept that data that we're going to be able to do a lot of statistics with. There's almost 20,000 people, alhamdulillah, that have completed that quiz, so it's a lot of data, and we're going to look into other aspects of that personality theory. So definitely this is something that we want to kind of look at empirically as well. At the first iteration it was conceptual. It wasn't a scientific process. It wasn't meant to be a scientific process in the sense that it was something that we took a survey and then we took out. It was a conceptual reading, a theoretical reading of the Quran and Sunnah, of different spiritual writers. And by the way, this is not just Ibn al-Qayyim. There are many other scholars as well in the article you've seen as well that we've kind of referred back to and quoted. And even to this day as well, and when I keep reading, because I have this in my head, I said, wow, this is this concept here. This is experience versus judgment here. This is, you kind of start seeing it in a lot of different writings as well. So I hope that kind of answers the question. Jazakumullah khair.
Yeah, just to add to that for the spiritual personality thing, part of it is one of the common misunderstandings is looking at these as personality descriptors, whereas the subcomponents are orientations of the mind, right? This is how the mind processes new information. And I think it comes from us using the term personality in a colloquial sense in a very superficial way, whereas when you actually study personality psychology, you study the Jungian archetypes, you actually realize that the way that they talk about personality and personality psychology is much more vast. It's how the mind processes the information that is presented to us at every single instance in time. So there's deep psychological substructures which determine how the human mind looks at different things and comes up with a particular behavioral approach to things. So I think that's adds on and complements what Zohaira was mentioning. The final question related to the fiqh aspect of the discussion is, our fiqh has been stagnant for the last few centuries, and quote-unquote reform is needed but has not been approached with the right tools. How can we revive our understanding of Islam in light of emerging changes without compromising its principles? That's obviously the million-dollar question. There is an article on Yaqeen Institute already by Sheikh Hatem al-Hajj that talks about renewal in Islamic discourse, and he lays out some of the principles for that, and there's going to be more articles on this subject as well. But basically, the important thing to keep in mind is that we have to look at what exactly is the nature of the changes that have been done, that have occurred in the last few centuries, and what is the relevance of those changes to the ilal that the scholars of Islam talked about, the different legal bases upon which rulings are constructed. So that's the important thing. It is true to say that there has been this stagnation, and it's because when you look at earlier efforts to systematize the Islamic legal ruling system, the Islamic value system, you look at, for example, Maqasid Sharia in the theory of Imam al-Shatibi. What are the major works after al-Shatibi, right? There's clearly a huge tradition that he's building upon, right? You had others who talked about these Maqasid before him, like Imam al-Juwayni, Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, Ibn Taymiyyah, Ibn al-Qayyim talked about this, and then you have a Shatibi, but then where are we going to take that next, right? And so that's the role of scholars in contemporary research, to talk about how this all fits together with the Islamic value system, the Islamic vision for humanity, and how that vision applies to some of the changes that we have in human society after the Industrial Revolution. So stay tuned for more articles on this topic as well, inshallah. Jazakumullah khair.
Jazakumullah khair, and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala increase all of us in knowledge and help us use it beneficially. So this concludes our session for this portion. Inshallah, after the Asr break, we will have the final section for the academic conference, which will be on ancestral knowledge. What does it mean for Muslims in the United States, with Dr. Muhammad Khalifa. So inshallah, at 3:45, we'll see you very soon. Jazakumullah khair.